almost as if he didn't exist. What we have is a character that was created hundreds of years later.
He was a religious leader, a preacher from 2,000 years ago. He was the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. He was the Son of God who came to become the central figure in Christianity.
There are two things to realize about Jesus. One, he really existed, and two, he was not remotely like the Jesus of the Gospels.
Any traditions about the historical Jesus were purely oral, something Christians might have talked about. Gospel writers also borrowed stuff from other religions.
We know for absolute certainty that he was baptized and he was crucified. In between those two events, he was a Jewish religious teacher who cultivated an enormous following, which still continues to this day.
We all know the Jesus of the Bible, his healings, his miracles, his trial, and his crucifixion. And you would presume that all of those events would be part of the historical record. But the problem is they aren't. The historical Jesus is something of a mystery.
Jesus was a Jewish religious leader from 2,000 years ago. The conventional story is that kings anticipated his birth. His mother didn't have sex. It was an immaculate conception. He starts his mission at 30. He's quite a rebel. The Romans get a bit, worried about him. He's crucified, died, and is resurrected 3 days later.
Well, personally, I wouldn't say that the Jesus, as written and evoked in the Bible, did exist in that way, because he did all sorts of miracles and he kind of floated up to heaven and back down again. I don't think any of that happened. But I think we can say that the historical Jesus, as in someone for whom there's empirical evidence that he actually existed, is true.
What we think we know from the Gospels is he was an apocalyptic preacher from a particularly rough end of the Roman Empire, Galilee, got himself into trouble with the priests in Jerusalem, crucified by the Romans, and died. And that's all we know for certain about the historical Jesus.
So what are the references to Jesus in the writings of the time? What are the facts that a whole religion has been based on? The truth is, well, not many. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian from the time of Jesus, only makes 2 references to him, and one of these is debatable. Josephus's writings cover a number of figures familiar to Bible readers. He discusses John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, the high priests, and the Pharisees. But Jesus, the Son of God, is at best only mentioned twice. This is probably the most famous passage in Josephus, and by far the most controversial. At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah.
The great Roman Jewish historian from Jerusalem, Josephus, he writes about everything, every little detail about life in Judea at this time, except Jesus. Actually, he does mention the word Messiah, but even that mention of the word Messiah tells scholars that's not what a Jewish man would call the Christos. He doesn't call it Christianity. So it's an indication that it's a fraud. It was added later.
The Jewish Messiah was supposed to be pure and simple, a great military leader who would kick the Romans out. And obviously Jesus failed on that count, totally. But the whole idea of being the Son of God was grafted on by by himself and all the early Christians.
In the epistles of St. Paul, written 25 years after Jesus' death, it's claimed that Jesus was executed by Pilate. We know for a fact that Pontius Pilate did exist. The Roman writer Tacitus wrote about a Christus being insulted by Nero over a fire in Rome. But it would appear that all mentions of Christ or Jesus were actually second-hand retelling of other accounts. Nothing at all was direct.
The Roman historian Tacitus is interesting because he uses the right phrase, the Christus, but the earliest copy we have of what he wrote is the 11th century. The first reference of his work is the 15th century. So it just adds to the belief that this is, in hindsight, someone adding some elements to his writing, talking about Christianity that they had learned and heard about much after the event.
It's extraordinary because religion demands certainty, and the one thing we don't have about Jesus is certainty. The story that we now have was manufactured decades and hundreds of years later. The very first references we have in the Gospels don't come until 60 years after his death, and the texts go through many, many evolutions. So the process of making Jesus into Christ the God is a long one happening all over the Roman Empire for